Michael bought his dream home, but one day he received a fine, $2,500 for his own fence. New rules, said HOA chairman Tony Pierce, confident that Michael would simply comply. But Tony had no idea who he was dealing with. Michael found a loophole that turned the game around, and when the truth came out, it was already too late. But let's start from the beginning. Michael was the kind of person who always tried to do everything right. A young professional, he had worked for years, saved money, and finally bought the house of his dreams in the suburbs of Chicago. A cozy lot with a well-maintained garden, a spacious backyard, and a strong wooden fence that he had installed to protect his private property. Everything seemed perfect, until one day, an unpleasant letter of happiness from the HOA arrived. A fine. For what? Illegal fence installation. Michael slowly scanned the text of the notice, feeling a wave of indignation rise within him. He knew for certain that the fence was entirely on his property, and therefore no approval from the HOA was needed. However, the document clearly stated, your fence does not comply with the new HOA standards, and you are fined $2,500. What nonsense, he muttered, rereading the letter in disbelief. His first reaction was simple, a mistake. There must have been some bureaucratic mix-up. He carefully checked all the documents, the plot plan, and the legality of his actions. Everything was flawless, but instead of peacefully enjoying his home, he was now forced to deal with this absurdity. Taking the documents, Michael went to the HOA office, where he was greeted by the association's chairman, Tony Pierce. A man with a strained smile and a commanding tone, he had long earned a reputation for liking to set his own rules and make everyone follow them. This is a standard procedure, Tony said calmly, not even glancing at the documents Michael had laid out before him. Your fence violates the new rules. What new rules? Michael asked, surprised. Tony simply shrugged. They were adopted last month. We decided that all fences should follow a certain style. Michael clenched his fists. His fence had been up for 2 years. But my house doesn't fall under these changes, he protested. These rules can't be applied retroactively. Tony waited for a moment, then spoke with a slight smile. We want to make our neighborhood better, right? That's when Michael realized this wasn't just a mistake. It wasn't bureaucracy, it was intentional pressure. Tony knew that the rules weren't applicable in this case, but he was still trying to push the situation, making Michael feel like he wasn't a homeowner, but a guest allowed to live there by the association's grace. Imagine what it's like. You buy a house thinking it's your space, your fortress, and then someone just decides they can impose their terms, change the rules, and dictate how you should live. It's absurd, but this story was only just beginning. Michael left the HOA office with a firm decision. He wasn't going to pay a single cent for the fine they had imposed illegally. He went home, reviewed all the papers again, and found an important detail. The HOA's charter had no clauses allowing changes to existing structures without the owner's consent. His fence was built before the new rules. Therefore, the fine was completely unlawful. But when he opened his mailbox the next day, there was another letter from the HOA. This time, they demanded that he dismantle the fence within 2 weeks or face additional fines and a possible lawsuit. That quickly? Michael nearly laughed. This is personal. He felt that this was no longer just about the fence. It was a matter of principle. If he gave in, the HOA would continue imposing new fines, restrictions, demands. Today, the fence. Tomorrow, they'd tell him what color his door should be, and then maybe which flowers he could plant in his yard. He wouldn't allow that. That same day, he contacted a lawyer who confirmed his suspicions. The HOA was breaking the law. They can't make you change anything on your property retroactively, especially without your consent, the lawyer said confidently. This gave Michael the confidence he needed. He wrote an official letter demanding the fine be canceled and that the HOA provide legal grounds for their claim against his fence. However, there was no response. Instead, a week later, he received another notice. Non-compliance with HOA rules. Fine increased to $5,000. Like that, he wasn't prepared for this twist. But now, everything was clear. The HOA was simply pressuring him, hoping he'd give in. Michael decided to take action. He started gathering signatures from neighbors, finding out if they had faced similar situations. And it turned out he wasn't alone. Many residents had also received strange fines for the most ridiculous reasons. Someone for having not green enough grass, someone for parking their car at the wrong angle. These fines were not only unfair, they were illegal. Now, this wasn't just his fight, it was a fight for the whole neighborhood. Michael couldn't let them win. Michael looked at the documents scattered across his kitchen table. His laptop was open, displaying legal articles, property rights explanations, and HOA regulations. His coffee mug had long gone cold, but he didn't even notice. He was too deep in his research. He understood that the HOA was not playing by the rules, but to win, he needed proof. He flipped through the HOA charter, studying every tiny detail. Somewhere in these lines was the answer, and Michael was sure he would find it. Every night, he sat at his laptop until his eyes started to sting from exhaustion, and on the third day, he found what he was looking for. According to the rules, the HOA could introduce new regulations, but they could not be applied retroactively. This meant that any changes adopted after he bought his house and built the fence could not apply to him. It was a loophole, a real lifesaver that could completely invalidate their demands. Michael reread the clause several times to make sure he understood it correctly, and then it hit him. What if the HOA had already used this trick on other homeowners? If they were trying to fine him by breaking their own rules, then they had likely done it before. He decided to investigate. The next day, he went to his neighbors. Most of them were polite but cautious. They already knew how the HOA treated those who dared to oppose it. "You think you're the first?" scoffed Mr. Randolph, an elderly man living across the street. "They tried to make me tear down my patio, which I built 10 years ago. Said it didn't meet the new standards." "And what did you do?" Michael asked. "I paid," the neighbor replied grimly. At the time, it seemed easier. That's exactly what the HOA was counting on. They knew that most people didn't want to deal with legalities, hire lawyers, or waste time and energy. It was easier to just pay the fine and move on. But Michael wasn't going to follow that path. He met with a few more neighbors and heard the same story. Ridiculous fines, strange new rules, demands to pay for things that shouldn't have been charged at all. This was a scheme, but now Michael had a weapon. He found another crucial fact. Tony Pierce, the HOA chairman, had personally created and approved 14 new regulations over the past 2 years, each one giving him more power. But the most interesting part, every single one of these changes somehow benefited him personally. For example, he enforced a rule about standardized fences, then recommended an official company to replace them, which, as it turned out, belonged to his friend. He made residents pay for community improvements, but the money was spent only on landscaping in front of his house, not the entire neighborhood. The more Michael uncovered, the angrier he got. "Why do they get to decide for me?" he muttered, spreading out the documents he had found. "This is my life, my property. Why should I be a hostage to their rules, which they make up whenever they want?" Now he knew. He had enough evidence to expose them. When Michael called his lawyer, the attorney listened carefully and said, "You have a real chance to overturn the fine and possibly achieve even bigger consequences for the HOA. The key is presenting the case correctly." They developed a strategy. The first step was an official letter to the HOA demanding that the fine be canceled, citing their own charter. Of course, Michael knew they wouldn't back down so easily, and he was right. 2 days later, he received a response. "Your request has been denied. You are required to comply with HOA regulations." They were still pushing, but now it didn't matter. Michael had already gained the support of his neighbors, many of whom were outraged when they learned how they had been exploited. He began organizing a meeting of homeowners, discussing the situation and involving local media. The day of the HOA meeting arrived. In the conference hall, where decisions were usually made without resistance, an angry crowd had gathered today. "Why are we being fined for something that was done legally?" someone shouted. "Where is our money going? Why are the financial reports so vague?" "We need answers." Tony Pierce tried to stay calm, but his face grew redder with each passing moment. He clearly hadn't expected people to start uniting against him. Then Michael stood up. "You claim that my fence violates new regulations, but these rules were adopted after it was built. According to your own charter, they cannot be enforced retroactively. That's illegal." Silence fell over the room. "Moreover," Michael continued, holding up a folder of evidence, "I have documents proving that you have been using your authority for personal gain. I have collected receipts, payments, and testimonies, and if you don't stop this, I will take everything to court and the media." Tony's face twitched. He tried to argue, but his voice was drowned out by the murmurs of discontented homeowners. Now he was trapped. He could continue pressuring people individually, but now they knew the truth. Now they were together. The next day, Michael filed a lawsuit. Other homeowners started filing collective complaints. The HOA was losing control. And a week later, journalists arrived. Now, not only the residents, but the entire city knew what kind of scheme the HOA had been running. Tony Pierce was losing his grip, and for the first time in a long time, the HOA realized they would have to answer for their actions. The courtroom was cold and sterile, the kind of place where people went to fight for their rights, or sometimes to lose them. Michael stood at the edge of the room, his palms sweating as he clutched the stack of documents. His lawyer, Mr. Sullivan, was already seated at the table, shuffling through the evidence. "This is it," Michael whispered to himself, trying to calm his nerves. "We can do this." The battle had begun. The HOA, through their lawyer, tried to look calm and collected, but Michael could see the tension in their eyes. They had not expected this. They thought that no one would dare to challenge them, that their power would remain unchallenged. But Michael wasn't backing down. Mr. Sullivan had prepared a strong case, citing the HOA's charter and the numerous violations they had committed. He had already requested documents from the HOA showing how the fines had been applied unfairly, and the judge had agreed to allow them to be presented as evidence. As the trial began, Michael could feel his heart pounding in his chest. He knew the importance of this moment. It wasn't just about the fence anymore. It was about holding powerful organizations accountable for the way they treated ordinary people. The HOA lawyer, a man named Mr. Thompson, stood up first. He tried to paint Michael as someone who was simply trying to get out of paying a fine, someone who didn't respect the community rules. But Michael had something Mr. Thompson didn't: the truth. One by one, Mr. Sullivan presented the documents, each piece of evidence further dismantling the HOA's arguments. The judge was attentive, jotting down notes and occasionally glancing at the faces of the HOA representatives, who were beginning to look uneasy. And then it was Michael's turn. He stood up slowly, adjusting his tie, feeling a wave of nervousness wash over him. But when he saw the judge's eyes on him, something shifted. This was his moment to speak. "I'm not here because I don't want to pay a fine," Michael began. "I'm here because I believe that no one should have the right to enforce rules that are not only unjust but also illegal. I didn't break any laws, I followed the rules, but the HOA has broken their own regulations over and over again. They have lied, they have cheated, and they have used their power to intimidate residents like me." The room was silent. Michael's voice echoed off the cold walls. "They've done this to so many others, and they thought no one would stand up to them. But I'm not just fighting for myself. I'm fighting for every homeowner who has been bullied into submission. This isn't about a fence. It's about holding people accountable for their actions." The judge nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. Michael sat back down, his heart still racing but his mind clearer than it had ever been. The next few days were filled with tension. The HOA lawyer tried to bring in new arguments, but each time they did, Mr. Sullivan shot them down. Michael had more than just legal facts on his side. He had the truth, and that was something the HOA could never fight. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the judge called for a recess. The tension in the room was palpable as everyone waited for the decision. When the judge returned, he addressed the room with a calm but firm tone. "After reviewing the evidence and the testimonies provided, I have come to the conclusion that the HOA's actions were, in fact, in violation of their own regulations. The fine imposed on Mr. Michael Davis is hereby dismissed." A collective gasp echoed through the room. The judge continued. "Furthermore, the HOA will be required to compensate Mr. Davis for any undue fees, and I am ordering a full review of the HOA's practices. If any other violations are found, legal action will be taken." Michael felt a wave of relief wash over him. He had won. He had actually won. The HOA representatives were speechless. Tony Pierce's face was ashen, and his lawyer looked like he had just seen a ghost. Michael couldn't help but feel a surge of satisfaction. He had done it. The morning after the trial felt strangely quiet. One would think that after such a major victory, Michael would finally be able to relax, take a deep breath, and move on with his life. But as he stepped out onto his porch, looking around the neighborhood, he realized this was only the beginning. People were talking, gathering in small groups, whispering among themselves. Some were smiling, others looked deep in thought. The truth had come out, and now the neighborhood would never be the same again. The news of the HOA scandal spread like wildfire. Local news stations reported on how one man stood up against an unjust system and won. Residents of other neighborhoods began to take notice, checking their own HOA policies, questioning whether they, too, had been victims of similar schemes. And then Michael started receiving messages. Complete strangers reached out to him on social media, thanking him for exposing the corruption. Some shared their own stories: unfair fines, unexplained fees, HOA rules that seemed to change overnight. People were waking up to the reality that they didn't have to accept these abuses. That's when Michael realized this was bigger than just a fence. "This isn't just my victory," he told his wife as they sat at the kitchen table sipping coffee. "This is a win for our right to be the true owners of our homes, to live without fear of being controlled by someone who thinks they're above the law." Meanwhile, the consequences for the HOA were worse than anyone had imagined. After the court ruling, local authorities launched an investigation into the HOA's financial practices. More irregularities surfaced: questionable financial records, manipulated documents, improper fines that had funneled money into the personal accounts of HOA board members. Tony Pierce, once the untouchable figurehead of the HOA, was now avoiding his neighbors altogether. His career in property management was over. After the high-profile trial, he had no choice but to resign, and soon after, he became the subject of formal legal scrutiny. For the remaining HOA board members, it became clear that they could no longer operate the way they had before. The pressure from the residents was too great. People who had once been afraid to speak up were now demanding transparency, fairness, and accountability. "We don't want to go back to the way things were," one neighbor said during a community meeting. "We need new leadership, honesty, and a real say in how our neighborhood is run." 1 month after the trial, the HOA, as it once existed, ceased to function. But Michael knew he couldn't just walk away from it all. He had seen firsthand how many people had been affected by similar injustices. His own fight had inspired others, and now he had an opportunity to help. He decided to organize public meetings where homeowners could learn about their rights, discuss laws, and understand how to protect themselves from similar HOA overreach. The first meeting took place at a local community center. Michael expected maybe 10 people to show up. Over 50 came. People listened attentively, sharing their own stories. Some brought printed copies of questionable fines they had received. Others had financial reports that didn't match up with actual expenses. "We can help each other," Michael told them. "If we unite, if we educate ourselves, if we stay vigilant, no one will be able to take advantage of us again." And it worked. Within months, homeowner advocacy groups formed across the city. Residents started pushing for policy changes, demanding financial transparency, and challenging unfair fines. Michael's story became an inspiration. Now that the dust had settled, he could finally enjoy the simple pleasures of life again. Sitting in his backyard, he sipped his tea and looked at the very fence that had started it all. The fence that had become a symbol of justice. Strangely enough, he even felt grateful to Tony Pierce, because if not for that ridiculous fine, Michael would have never realized just how important it was to stand up for his rights. Now he knew one thing for sure: the system works, but only if people are willing to fight for justice. And who knows, maybe his story would inspire someone else to take a stand and say, "Enough." It was finally over. After months of battles, endless disputes, and courtroom hearings, Michael could finally do something he hadn't done in a long time. Just sit on his porch, drink his morning coffee, and listen to the gentle rustling of the trees in the wind. He looked at the fence, the very thing that had started it all. But now, it wasn't a symbol of conflict. Now, it was a reminder that justice exists, but only if you're willing to fight for it. Neighbors began gathering outside his house. Some brought freshly baked goods as a token of gratitude. Others simply came to shake his hand. The atmosphere in the neighborhood had changed. The fear that once loomed over them, the fear that someone in power could impose arbitrary rules and fines, was gone. "You're a real hero, Michael," said Mr. Randolph, clapping him on the shoulder. "I thought things like this only happened in movies." Michael chuckled. "If someone had told me a year ago that I'd be taking the HOA to court, I wouldn't have believed them either." But the most surprising part came later. A few weeks after the trial, Michael noticed that his story had begun to spread. First, it was local newspapers, then interviews, and soon, homeowners from other neighborhoods started reaching out to him for advice. People sent letters, messages. We're dealing with the same thing. How do we fight unfair HOA fines? What can we do if our HOA is breaking the law? It was unexpected. Michael had only wanted to stand up for himself, but now he was at the center of something much bigger. He knew he couldn't let this momentum fade. Together with his neighbors, they organized a series of meetings where they educated homeowners about their rights, how to handle similar situations, which documents to check, and what legal actions to take. The first meeting was held in a small local library. Michael thought maybe 10 people would show up. More than 100 came. "We're all here because we're tired of being silent," Michael began, scanning the crowd. "But I want you to know something. Even when it feels like the system is too powerful, even when it seems like you have no chance, you have rights, and if you stand up for them, victory is possible." People listened, they nodded, asked questions, shared their own experiences. Many of them, for the first time, felt like they weren't alone, and that was more important than any court victory. Meanwhile, the neighborhood continued to change. Months had passed since the trial, and now everything was different. The new HOA leadership was made up of honest residents who didn't seek power but fairness. Every decision was now made transparently, with input from the homeowners. No one had to fear being fined for the color of their fence or the shape of their mailbox anymore. People finally felt like they truly owned their homes. And Tony Pierce? He had disappeared from town. After his organization collapsed, he was unable to restore his reputation. He had once thought he could control people's lives. Now, he was just a man who had lost everything because of his own greed. One evening, Michael stood outside his house, watching as neighbors gathered for another community meeting, this time not to protest, but simply to come together as a neighborhood. "You don't regret standing up to them, do you?" his wife asked, stepping onto the porch. Michael smiled. Not for a second. And he truly didn't. Because now he knew. Anyone can be broken by the system. But if you believe in yourself, if you refuse to back down in the face of injustice, victory is possible. Michael's story inspired thousands of people. It proved that even against a powerful organization, one person could stand up and defend their rights. And now, no one could take away his home, his dignity, or his freedom.